So we're in your government book. We're in chapter 7, the last section, the executive branch. We're talking about the executive branch, but we're talking about the bureaucracy. When we think of the executive branch, of course, you think of the president and the vice president, but you get into his cabinet members, onto all of these agencies that have been created to regulate us through the executive branch. The executive branch actually has, the part in seeing that laws are carried out. And so this bureaucracy becomes huge. In fact, the bureaucracy now has become as making the laws too. They make their own laws, these agencies, and carry them out, and actually, to the point that they even have their own judges and to give fines if they're not carried out, right? And so we've been going on in this chapter, and this chapter actually gives me a gut ache because our bureaucracy has become such a monster. So let's talk about how can the presidency, how can our government, reform this huge bureaucratic monster, the bureaucracy. So how do we do that? Today, the number of civilian federal employees is about the size of the United States when George Washington became president in 1789. Can you believe that? That's how many employees we have for the government. About as big as the United States was when George Washington was president, right? It's crazy, that many people. The federal bureaucracy has grown until both its size and power have become very unimaginable. They can't manage it. It's just unable to manage. So crazy. This unproductive growth must be reversed. Congress can bring the problem of this bloated and oppressive government under control in 3 ways. What can Congress do? What can we do? We can reorganize it, we can reduce it somehow, and we can remove it. So how can the government do this? So let's talk about reorganization first. Reorganization. So to reorganize the executive branch, especially the bureaucracy, Congress has appointed several commissions to investigate and suggest ways to do it. In 1949 and 1955 were the first and second Hoover commissions. And these were headed by former President Herbert Hoover. So the Congress passed a series of acts, at this point, authorizing the president to reorganize the executive branch, and submitted these to Congress. And later on, 60 days, they would automatically take place. Well, it had made it quite better in some ways, but it didn't really result in smaller government as thought would happen, because it often just took certain agencies and combined them under one head, kind of making them one big agency, right? And a major hurdle in reducing the number of federal employees, getting rid of them, the certain amount of employees, made problems even more problematic. So basically, in these reorganization plan, were not making smaller government, and often involving combining these agencies, and to reduce it was even more crazy. And as for reducing and getting rid of employees, and we'll find out why. So the reduction. The reorganization will be more effective. It actually reduces the number of agencies and the total number of bureaucrats rather than just transferring them around. Besides the number of agencies and personnel, Congress should also reduce the number of regulations produced by agencies and the level of discretionary authority they exercise. This is very important. What is discretionary authority? Means they can have just authority as they see. So really taking away their authority to be able to do some of these things is very important. Reduce size, so let's talk about reducing the size. So true reduction would entail the elimination of some departments, like the departments of commerce and energy and education, which have done little to improve the areas they foresee. So reforming the tax code to simpler taxes would eliminate most of the employees at the IRS. The IRS has a ton of bureaucracy, a ton of employees. And think of if you get rid of the employees have to find other jobs too. So you'll have a job problem there too. Even though it's difficult to reduce the number of government workers, it is possible. So, and I gave you one example is President Clinton in 2001. Actually, the number of federal civilian employees had been reduced by 365,000. So that's a big number. Here we have a picture here, President Hoover there with reports over the Hoover Commission trying to basically reorganize this bureaucracy is another bureaucracy, right? So here's Clinton here and Vice President Gore discussing a document that was trying to basically result in the National Performance Review. And so even in doing this, there was more bureaucracies. So a major hurdle in reducing the number of federal employees is the many protections they're afforded to the bureaucrat to protect them. So a lot of government jobs are protected. They have their tenure and everything, and they're protected jobs. And so excessive procedures have been put in place to protect these workers, right? As a result, bad behavior is too often rewarded. One effect is that it allows workers who are lazy and incompetent to continue working for the government without being fired. And you have this horrible picture right here of this woman here who was reprimanded for neglect, and she actually threatened a supervisor. And she was given paid leave to pend her ongoing investigation. And while she was on paid leave, she got another job. So she not only was getting paid from her previous job and situation, but another job. And now she had two salaries. And so the system actually rewarded her time being paid for her poor performance. So, well, it says here it's reasonable that there should be protections for government workers who are whistleblowers, those who report illegal behavior on the job site. However, the neglect of duty should not be protected. Incompetence should not be rewarded, right? Right here it says one study indicated that only about 0.1%, think of 0.1% of the federal employees are fired in a given year. So hardly any government employees are fired. They have their jobs, are very protected. This is because the government employers have to invest a large amount of money and time into dismissing unproductive workers. So they don't want to do it. It usually takes a year of investigation, a year or more, to dismiss or fire an employee that's in error. Hard to fire. Federal employees are paid with revenues that come from the hard-earned dollars of the American people, and they are expected to perform their jobs with excellence. But many government workers do this, but a lot of them don't, right? Let's go on to reducing regulations. What about these regulations? Well, the federal what do we call it? Register, where all of our laws are, and the Code of Federal Regulations have grown. There's so many regulations, into like pages and pages. We already went over this. These two publications give us a measure of growth in federal regulations, more and more regulations, right? So if the number of federal agencies and employees were reduced, it would likely lead to the reduction in regulations, right? So then Congress can look at these books and say, okay, we don't have so many regulations because, we're reducing our bureaucracy. That would be, evident, right? So one president, of course, that really did a good job in doing this was in 1982, President Ronald Reagan authorized what's called the Grace Commission to investigate how a bureaucracy might be reformed, so the commission came up with 2,000 recommendations for the government to implement to reduce the size of bureaucracies, right, and save money. So Reagan was able to implement about 800 out of these 2,000, which is a big deal. And so the number of the new regulations in the Federal Register was reduced then, at that point, 43%. It went down 43%. That's almost 50%, you can imagine. But, later on, the next presidency just blew it from that point, we see. This process of reducing the number of regulation is called deregulation. Deregulation is getting rid of some of our rules and regulations, deregulating. Later presidents, of course, reversed this from Reagan. So we had a lot from that point that actually put in more regulations. And so what Reagan did was kind of later on redone by the next presidents. So a reduction in the number of agencies and employees would produce a smaller government, right? So if we had a smaller government, that would be small enough for Congress and the president to supervise it more effectively. How can they supervise this huge, gigantic bureaucracy? It's very hard. So as the federal government has taken on more national responsibilities, Congress has been unable to keep up with the growth of the bureaucracy. Therefore, Congress now has allowed these agencies to make many decisions without even reviewing them or giving them permission. So right now, Congress can't control them. The authority Congress gives agencies to make their decision regarding the public areas. Congress says, okay, just you guys go do it, And this is called discretionary authority. So basically saying, okay, we made this agency to regulate, take the IRS or whatever to regulate us. Just go, you have the discretionary authority to do what you think is right. That gives them a lot of authority, in the midst that hasn't been gone through Congress, our elected senators and congressmen, has it? So that's a big problem to reduce discretionary authority. So the reduction in the number of agencies and employers would make smaller government, so which we want to do. So Congress has revealed that agencies have used their power to establish regulations that Congress never intended or never envisioned them to do. So they never intended this, but now they have power. How do we get rid of this bureaucratic monster? Here's the example here that they give here is the EPA has tried to take legislation aimed for air pollution. So they said the Environmental Protection Agency, they said, okay, you do what you say to deal with air pollution. So they just said, well, not only are we going to deal with air pollution, we're going to deal with global warming. Well, they were not given the power to deal with global warming or climate change at this point. So basically, that they thought we have the power to do what we want to do. So Congress can also effectively limit the size and activities of the federal agencies by carefully limiting their annual budgets. What a good idea. Congress can say, okay, since, we're not really agreeing, we're not going to give you any money. We're going to limit your budget, so you're only going to have this small budget. They probably would think twice by doing a lot of excess things they're not allowed to do. The best solution to reducing agencies' discretionary authority, giving them too much authority, is to remove the bureaucracy from matters pertaining to social welfare. So, in a socialistic climate like we have today, where the government wants to give and take care of the people, and that's it. Instead of letting the state and local government, the government becomes bigger and bigger. So. Since the 1930s, there has been a deliberate effort on the part of socialists and political liberalists to change the basic concept of the American government, saying, well, America needs to provide and take care of you as like a parent, and that's not what our founding fathers had for our government, because in that way, the government can give you things, but also take away. Do whatever they want to do. So, removal. So one way to say, okay, we're not going to deal with any type of social issues in the national government. Let it go, give it to the state, give it to the local, give it to the private agencies, give it to the church, right? So removal, let's go on to removal. Another solution has to be to remove and return decision-making, again, like I said before, to return decision-making to the state and local governments. And this concept is called revival of federalism, basically returning the state. So the state government has more power than the national government does in certain issues. And so do our local governments, our cities, so the national government is not taking over. Many of the decisions currently made by the federal lawmakers in the areas of drugs, education, and punishment of criminals would be better decided at the state and local levels, where bureaucratic programs could be supervised more closely by those closest to the problems. So let's let these things, dealing with drugs and education and criminals and all these things, be dealt with the local cities, the state governments, instead of the federal government, which knows little about the situation. So, and this situation says our national freedoms depend on the role of local government. And I think an example here of Democracy in America is Alex de Tocqueville, and I really like him. He observed that local governments are the strength of a free nation. By allowing states and local communities to resume their traditional roles in the conduct of American government, we would eliminate the need for this huge bureaucracy, right? So, of course, where we're at in our modern time, technical age, there are responsibles the federal government are going to have to take on, we know that. But these tasks could be returned to the states, a lot of them. And this will reverse the long trend towards central control, right? But it could lead to the establishment of a more beneficial system of government for America, right? Not this big bureaucracy. Congress could also give some tasks to the private sector, like federal government does not need to be operating our train system, or does the federal government need to be really operating our post office like this? Maybe we could be giving it to a private section. It says, traditionally, most Americans have viewed the purpose of government as the protection of the individual and his property. But in recent years, however, many have come to the view that the purpose of the government as the promotion of social and financial equality. So Americans in the past have thought the government is there to protect us. We have an army to protect us, to protect our property, and to protect our rights the Constitution gives us. But, of course, now a lot of people think the government is there to promote our social and financial equality, make us all equal. That's called socialism. That's called communism in the run. So this last part, and I'm going to just kind of read over this because I thought it's very important, and I was going to take a few things, but I thought I'd just go over it here so that you can see, as Milton Friedman summarized the situation that we're in right now. And so he discussed the terms of equality and liberty to our situation. Our political tradition first is different from the early days of our republic to what it is now. And so he wants to show why. Why is it so different now? What has happened in the midst of our government? And so he mentions that the concept of equality has been expanded or changed. And so let me read a little bit of this. Just hold on. Equality came more and more to be interpreted as the equality of opportunity, in the sense that no one should be prevented by arbitrary obstacles from using his capacities to pursue his own objectives. That is still the dominant meaning to most citizens of the United States. So the equality of opportunity, that no one should be prevented, from capacities, for freedoms. And then he goes on and explains that neither equality before God nor equality of opportunity presented any conflict with our liberty, our freedom to shape our own life. So, but quite the opposite. Equality and liberty were two faces of the same basic value back then, right? So basically the equality of opportunity, they didn't have any problems. But then he points out that today the situation has changed drastically. There's a very different meaning of equality now has emerged in the United States. It's called the equality of outcome, that everyone should have the same level of living or income and should finish the race at the same time. Everybody should be equal. The equality of outcome is a clear conflict with freedom. Go to communist nations and see how free the people are there. The attempt to promote it has been a major source of bigger and bigger government and of government imposed restrictions on our freedoms and liberties. So he concludes by pointing out the dangers of the concept of government, which many are promoting today, and the advantages of going back to that traditional concept, right? He says, a society that puts equality in the sense of quality of outcome ahead of freedom will end up with neither equality nor freedom. The use of force now to achieve equality will destroy freedom, as communism has come in, forcing to achieve equality. Well, let's make everybody equal. We're going to take your stuff and give them, right? And the force introduced by good purposes will end up in the hands of people who use to promote it for their own interest. So there'll be certain people that will get everything, very small amount of people that will be very wealthy, and everyone else will be so-called equally poor. On the other hand, a society that puts freedom first will, as a happy byproduct, so if we put freedom first, end up with both greater freedom and greater equality. Though a byproduct of freedom, greater equality is not an accident. A free society realizes the energies and abilities of the people to pursue their own objectives, their own dreams, right? It prevents some people from suppressing other people. And it does not prevent some people from achieving positions of privilege, of course, but so long as freedom is maintained, it prevents those positions of freedom from becoming institutionalized, that now the government controls that. So going on, freedom means diversity, but also mobility. It preserves the opportunity for today's disadvantaged to become tomorrow's privilege, that anyone has the American dream can become something. I can't do that in all countries, in most countries of the world, I should say. So it gives freedom. And in this process, almost everyone from top to bottom can enjoy a fuller and richer life. I love what he said. So the trend towards this bigger government must be reversed if America is to be free. So Woodrow Wilson said, the history of liberty, that's freedom, is a history of limitation of government power, not increase of it. It's kind of weird that Woodrow Wilson would say that because he was kind of a socialist, right? But for him to say this, the history of freedom is a history of limitation of government power. So it says here, of course, government can restore to its improper role only if American people are willing to accept responsibility for their own affairs and reject this current philosophy of the government being our parent, governmental paternalism. Past generations of America reverenced the Bible and held in high esteem its teaching that each man is responsible for his own well-being and that of his family. American government is not responsible, the family is. America is in need of spiritual revival. Yeah, sure is, isn't it? We need a revival, which would, among other things, bring a restoration of individual responsibility to our people. Restore the responsibility to our people, not to a government that can become a tyrant and control and take away our freedom. I like the man's name. Just remember, Friedman. Actually, his name was Friedman, huh? He's talking about freedom. This last section here, and I'm going to just kind of just read parts of it, but it's another one like, oh my goodness. The foundations of American liberty put from petty dictatorships are proliferating the federal government. We have these petty dictatorships of regulatory agencies, they're coming in to regulate us, right? So it says here, the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution states, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That's what Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1787. And we have the Bill of Rights that are entitled to us. Unfortunately for Americans, the Bill of Rights is not important to a lot of governmental agencies or to citizens, right? It says, in recent decades, the Due Process Clause largely has been swept aside in the citizens' dealings with federal regulators, trying to regulate us, inspectors, inspecting us, enforcers, and tax collectors, getting their money, while courts have created new due process rights for welfare recipients. Now, what do we need to give them? Disruptive school children, criminal defendants, and forgetting those farmers and homeowners and parents and businesses. We have kind of a weird system now, don't we? So the modern idea of due process appears to permit citizens to exhaust their life savings fighting what? Court battles against these heavy-handed bureaucracies, right? Government agencies. It says, the trademark of modern political thinking is faith in discretionary power. We talked that power, that now these agencies have a lot of power. And they're giving this power, by benevolent politicians and administrators, letting government employees treat private citizens just as they think is best. They're just citizens, right? Whereas in previous areas, citizens worried only about the sheriff and the tax collector. Now they often have to face the power and authority of zoners, wage regulators, compulsory preservationists, environmentalists, equal opportunity enforcers, important price controllers, occupational licensures, and others. There's huge volume. It basically goes on. The larger government has grown. The larger it grows, the less control, the less control it has because the agencies are coming. The United States has extensive government in the past, but never has it been so unconstrained by guided principles of the Constitution or any concept of the rule of law. Not only have government agencies gotten bigger, they have slipped their constitutional leashes, saying, well, we don't really have to go by the Constitution. We have our own laws to worry about. We're going to make sure that the citizens are complying to our regulations. So never have there been so many and so little concerned, as agencies are. And it goes on to the Reign of Terror, and this, I'm not going to go over it here, but it talks about, you can read about the Food and Drug Administration and the Reign of Terror of the Food and Drug Administration. We know that, especially in these last few years. And that the Food and Drug has de facto power to destroy, financially companies and control the medicals, control doctors and such. It's gotten so out of control. Let's just say that. So it says, Kenneth Feather, head of the FDI's Drug Advertising Surveillance Branch, boasted in 1991. What is he boasting about? We want to say to these companies that you don't know when or how will strike. We want to eliminate predictability. That may be an excellent rule of thumb or a third world junta. but it is a peculiar goal for a high-ranking federal regulator. So, and this made regulating, terrorizing, kind of the same thing, right? Going on with the FDA and the problems of the FDA, the federal drug, we can see it on doctors and such. Federal officers routinely show their dedication to the environment now. We're talking about the environment by bragging about the number of jail sentences they imposed on private citizens and corporations because they didn't follow the rules of the Environment Protection Agency, right? So in May of 1992, Justice Department press release proclaiming the department obtained the highest level of fines ever, a 10% increase in environmental criminal convictions. What a brag. You can imagine. So nation's environmental laws, they bragged of 191 criminal indictments and a record of $163 million so-called dollars in criminal penalties. And that they're racking up record scores of private citizens that are increasingly being wronged and oppressed. They were bragging. And they talk here about the Superfund program, to deal with the ban to get rid of hazardous waste under the EPA. And this is really crazy. So going on, Congress, the federal government has spent almost $10 trillion for Superfunds and forced private parties to spend much more money, $80 trillion, forcing private parties for this. And this is terrible. And it has only cleaned up about 160 of the 1,202 dangerous landfills. It spent so much money. Where's all the money going, The EPA has interpreted the 1980 legislation to allow it to impose practically unlimited liability on tens and thousands of companies and private organizations. They have just unlimited control. The EPA intentionally has disregarded equity and fairness in its prosecution on firms that are allegedly contributed hazardous materials. So saying, okay, we don't care, you better clean this up. And so the Superfund was generating intolerable injustices. In some cases, it may be degenerating into a simple robbery with the environmental badger. We're just going to come and rob you, right? So it has almost no evidence before it imposes potentially bankrupting liabilities on private business firms. They had one where down here, a scrap metal, they said you have to basically come in and clean this up. And it was the fact that the only evidence linking the clothing rental, it was a clothing rental company that had paid someone $14 in 1972 to haul trash there. And they said this little rental company had to clean it up. And they had to go out of business because they couldn't clean it up. So that's kind of stuff going on. The EPA also, that's Environment Protection Agency, has made a mockery of due process in the RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, that was passed in 1976. The EPA has issued more than 17,000 pages of regulations that are proposed in regulating, and they're all in this Federal Register, right? And it costs the businesses and governments approximately $30 trillion a year. The more regulations the agency issues, the more incomprehensible the program becomes. And the program now says basically to clean up their factory backgrounds or background levels, and this is getting crazy. However, background levels usually have no relation to safeguarding human health. If someone poured a glass of chlorinated tap water onto the ground, the RCRA cleanup site, he would be fined for polluting, right? But then again, a lot of the under the safe and drinking law, the safe permit to discharge it was basically hazardous anyway. So hazardous has become the contemporary equivalent of what James Madison termed the tyrant's plea, saying emergency. And the word now has a blank check for unlimited power over regulating producers and individuals. Regulation by memo is unlawful, undemocratic in many cases, but unstoppable. On to the issue of arbitrary power goes to the heart of the modern debate over the nature of freedom or liberty, whether it is the result of limits on government, coercion of unlimited government power, or whether citizens are free when government is restrained or when government officials are giving carte blanche to do what they please. Carte blanche is basically saying, okay, these agencies can just do as they please. And this is called faith and discretionary power, which means faith in giving government officials the power to punish whom they please and to assume that such actions will make the United States a better society. So going on, more arbitrary government policies the more they become, the less secure our citizenship will be. The United States has sought to achieve security for the average citizen by vesting government officials with sweeping discretion over how that person is treated, employed, promoted, paid, housed. Faith in these discretionary power simply is faith in the superiority of the government. The government knows best. So employees to private citizens, faith in letting some people coerce others to follow government officials' will. Quite a deal, this huge bureaucracy, and how we need to, reduce the monstrosity of this bureaucracy is so important. So let's go on, and I want to go on to just some questions here that we have. What are some ways Congress could begin to reform bureaucracy? We went over those, right? To reorganize the executive branch, to reorganize it, which doesn't work well. To reduce the regulations, that would be good. But to reduce and take away their power, their discretionary power would be important. To remove some of these agencies, that would be good. And to give some of the revival of federalism, to take it out of the federal government, the power from these bureaucracies, and give them to the state and local and private agencies would be the most important way. So to cite Milton Friedman, what are the traditional conceptions and the terms of equality and liberty, and what is the current conception? Okay, so traditional equality and liberty is equality before God. That's what our forefathers, and liberty to shape one's own life, right? But currently, people are saying it's equal opportunity, basically saying that everyone needs to be equal economically, and that is socialism, right? So according to President Woodrow Wilson, what is the history of liberty? The history of liberty is a history of the limitation of government and power, not the increase. So basically saying the history of freedom, the more freedom we have is when we have less government, right? So that's about, goes on here. So that's about all for this section. And we're done with chapter 7, but you can see chapter 7 gave you a gut ache, right? Gave me a gut ache because we see how our bureaucracy is becoming, and it depends on who our next president is. We want a president that's going to decrease our bureaucracy. It's going to basically decrease all the handouts and everything, because if the more we have, the more we're going to go into a dictator controlling. And in the end times, there's going to be Antichrist coming to control the world. And so the more we have of this huge bureaucracy becomes very intentionally to look towards a one world order, right? So let's look and pray for our country. And we do not want to have an uncontrolled bureaucracy controlling us, do we? So that's it for this chapter.